In the final minute of the Indiana Fever's home season opener, head coach Stephanie White turned to her assistants on the bench and asked a question that has since ignited every WNBA fan platform in existence. What do you think they're going to run here? 4 words, and not just any 4 words. 4 words spoken by the defensive-minded head coach who was hired specifically because she was supposed to have those answers locked in before tip-off. That clip spread fast, not because fans are looking for reasons to tear Stephanie White down, but because it crystallized everything that has been building since the moment this offseason roster started taking shape. The Indiana Fever just lost their home opener to the Dallas Wings, a team that won exactly 10 games last season, not 20, not 16. And they didn't just lose. They surrendered over 100 points on the night their defensive identity was supposed to announce itself to the national audience that had shown up specifically to see something worth believing in. If you have been paying close attention to this franchise since last November, you were not shocked. You saw the architecture of this problem being built in real time, and you deserve a real breakdown, not the everything is fine narrative, not the it's just game one rationalization, but an honest examination of what that building, those comment sections, those social media ratios, and that viral coaching moment are collectively telling us about where this team actually is. If this kind of analysis cuts through the noise for you, hit that like button right now. It signals to the algorithm that this story matters, and it keeps us doing deep dives like this one when the league would much prefer nobody ask these questions too loudly. Let's start with what the numbers are actually saying. The Indiana Fever came into the season carrying the weight of the most-watched team in women's basketball. The arrival of Caitlin Clark had fundamentally transformed the franchise's visibility. Arena sellouts, national broadcast packages, a fan base that extended well beyond Indianapolis and well beyond traditional WNBA audiences. Year 2 was supposed to be the proof of concept. The coaching locked in, the roster improved, the results starting to match the potential. Instead, the opening game was a home loss to a Dallas Wings team that went 10-30 just months ago. The specific number you need to hold on to from that night is this: 1,500 likes to nearly 4,000 comments on the Fever's official final score post. If you've spent any time understanding social media engagement patterns, you already know what that ratio signals. Healthy posts generate likes at a rate that significantly exceeds comment volume. That's what celebration and positive response looks like online. When comments dramatically outpace likes, that is anger talking. That ratio is not a data point you can spin or contextualize away. That is the unfiltered audience verdict rendered in real time by tens of thousands of people who had real expectations walking into that building. Direct calls to address specific roster pieces who were generating no discernible value on either end of the floor, and threading through all of it, the loudest complaint of the night: nobody on this team is setting screens for Caitlin Clark while she's being physically beaten on every possession, and the officials are letting it happen. These are not observations from people who don't understand basketball. These are fundamental execution failures that any fan who has watched elite basketball at any level can identify from the upper deck. Caitlin Clark's individual performance is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because she is the reason that arena was at capacity, she is the reason the national cameras were positioned in Indianapolis, and she is the reason the WNBA is entering this season with the highest viewership expectations in the league's history. On opening night, she looked like someone operating inside a system that hadn't figured out how to deploy her. The rhythm that made her historically dominant at Iowa was absent. The spacing that made her shooting range a weapon that defenses genuinely feared was nowhere to be found. What remained was a player absorbing physical contact on every touch, while her teammates failed to generate any structural relief. The contrast between Clark's utilization at Iowa and her utilization inside the Fever system is not a subtle stylistic difference. It is a fundamental philosophical gap. At Iowa, the offensive architecture had one organizing principle: create open looks for Caitlin Clark. And it connects directly back to the moment that started this whole conversation. A defensive-minded head coach, in the final minute of a game her team was losing to a 10-win opponent, asking her assistants what the opposing team was planning to run. Stephanie White came to Indiana after her tenure at Vanderbilt, where the program's trajectory had not been upward. She was hired by the Fever's front office with a specific mandate: install a defensive culture, build a professional environment, and give this roster a foundation that Clark's offensive ability could be built on top of. The roster construction concerns compound every coaching question. This team entered the season overloaded at the guard position, short on the interior length that disrupts opposing offenses and protects the defensive glass, and missing the versatile frontcourt pieces that every serious analyst identified as critical gaps during the off-season acquisition period. Those concerns were raised publicly and repeatedly by people who have spent decades evaluating basketball rosters. They were dismissed in various corners of Fever media as negativity, as people who didn't trust the process, as fans who didn't understand what the coaching staff was building. And then the first game played out in front of 17,000 people in Indianapolis who watched every one of those concerns materialize simultaneously. The second unit's inadequacy deserves its own examination. People who have been watching professional basketball for 4 and 5 decades, who remember the championship rosters of the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, who understand what genuine depth looks like across a 40-game regular season, watched the Fever's bench and drew direct comparisons to the teams that currently set the standard at the top of this league. The specific benchmark being cited in serious analytical circles is the New York Liberty's second unit. The assessment from voices who know this game, the Liberty's reserve players, the ones not even in the starting lineup, would run the Fever bench out of a gym. That is not emotional hyperbole from a fan base nursing a loss. That is a structural evaluation from people who've watched enough basketball to recognize depth crises before they become organizational disasters. The only opponents that experienced observers are identifying as realistic automatic wins for this Fever roster right now are the Phoenix Mercury and the Chicago Sky, not the teams hovering around 500, not the mid-tier franchises that swing between playoff contention and lottery territory. Just 2 teams. That is how significantly the season expectations have been recalibrated after a single game played at home against one of the weakest opponents on the schedule. What makes this particularly damaging is the timing. The WNBA just recorded its most watched season opener in league history. The Fever were central to those viewership numbers. 17,000 fans packed Gainbridge Fieldhouse for opening night. National broadcast attention was fully positioned in Indianapolis. The league had everything necessary to demonstrate that the momentum from last year's breakthrough season was real, accelerating, and worth sustained investment by the casual sports audience that has been gradually paying more attention to women's basketball. What aired on national television instead was a disjointed offensive performance, a defensive breakdown, and a coaching staff caught visibly confused in the game's most critical moment. That is not just a disappointing night for people who bought tickets. That is a wasted opportunity at precisely the moment when the WNBA cannot afford to waste opportunities. The windows of national sports attention do not stay open indefinitely, and every time the cameras are on and the product falls short, it costs the league credibility with the casual viewers who showed up out of curiosity and stayed hoping to see something worth coming back for. The question hanging over Indianapolis now is whether the people with decision-making authority inside that organization are prepared to look honestly at what everyone on the outside has been watching clearly, or whether the response will be to wait and see and hope the calendar fixes what the roster and the system have not. Before we go deeper into where this situation is headed, drop a comment right now and tell us, are you still holding out optimism for this Fever season after what happened against Dallas, or did the opening night performance confirm something you had been quietly dreading since the roster was finalized? This community has been watching this franchise more carefully than almost anyone, and that perspective genuinely shapes the analysis. The fan revolt following the season opener is not the standard post-loss venting cycle that fades within 48 hours when the next game arrives. What emerged in the hours after the final buzzer in Indianapolis represents something with a different character entirely, a fracture between distinct audience communities that have been operating in uneasy alignment and finally cracked under the pressure of watching their shared worst fears confirmed on the biggest possible stage. The Indiana Fever's current fan base is not a monolithic community. It is a coalition. Longtime franchise supporters who have followed this team through losing seasons and roster rebuilds long before Caitlin Clark existed, layered with a massive wave of new viewers who came to the WNBA specifically because of Clark's historic college career and the cultural moment she generated. These two groups have different reference points, different loyalty structures, and different tolerances for organizational dysfunction. In the aftermath of the Dallas loss, those communities began talking past each other openly. Some longer-tenured Fever supporters expressed frustration toward what they perceived as Clark-specific fans, demanding that every organizational decision be filtered through the lens of maximizing one player. Meanwhile, Clark fans pointed at the product on the floor and argued that the league's most marketable player being deployed in a system that doesn't maximize her strengths is not a reasonable approach to building a competitive team. In the middle of this sits a layer of influencer and media voices trying to hold an everything is fine narrative together, while the comment sections under their posts revolt in real time. That coalition fracture is strategically dangerous for the franchise in ways that go beyond a single lost game. The ones who showed up last season out of novelty and stayed because the product was genuinely compelling are not the same emotionally bonded fans who will ride out a difficult season out of franchise loyalty. Committed fans rationalize. Casual fans simply disengage. And the Indiana Fever's attendance records, their television ratings, their merchandise revenue, and ultimately their franchise valuation are all partially built on an audience layer that has no obligation to stay engaged through a season that is giving them reasons to stop paying attention. If this kind of layered breakdown of what's actually happening beneath the headlines is why you keep coming a channel member, and the Indiana Fever's attending a channel member, in an issue 2 coming a channel member, I shall keep coming a channel member. Your support is what makes it possible to keep doing this level of analysis instead of settling for the surface takes that everyone else is running with. The Stephanie White question deserves more serious examination than it has been getting in mainstream Fever coverage, because the hiring decision itself carries weight that extends beyond one bad opening game. Indiana's front office hired her with a specific promise: defensive identity, culture change, a professional infrastructure that their star player could trust. The calculation from the front office's perspective appears to have been that White's defensive credentials would translate into immediate improvement on that end of the floor, which would in turn give Clark's offensive ability a more stable platform to operate from. The opening game tested that calculation and produced results that raised genuine questions about whether the translation is occurring. What effective defensive coaching looks like in the final minute of a close game is projecting specific, confident direction to your player. You know their tendencies, their personnel preferences, their go-to sets in pressure situations. Your job in that moment is to communicate what you know with clarity and conviction, because your players are reading you for confidence as much as they're reading you for information. Visible uncertainty in a coaching staff communicates downward through the roster immediately. Players feel it in how instructions are delivered. The clip of White asking her assistants what the Wings might run is going to follow this coaching staff for as long as the losses continue. That is simply the reality of the modern media environment. Moments like that become shorthand for broader narratives, and the broader narrative that clip is being used to support that this coaching staff lacks the preparation and the authority to manage high-pressure situations against competitive opponents is not a narrative the front office can afford to have gaining traction before the season is a week old. If you are following this story and sharing it with anyone who cares about the Fever's direction right now, this is the moment to do it, because the story is moving fast and a lot of people are still operating on incomplete information about what actually happened inside that building on opening night. The financial stakes attached to this situation extend well beyond wins and losses on the court. The WNBA is currently navigating one of the most consequential growth windows in the league's history. New broadcast partnerships, expanding media coverage, franchise valuations climbing at rates that would have seemed implausible 5 years ago, and a player in Caitlin Clark who has demonstrated a documented ability to drive cultural conversations that reach audiences with no prior connection to women's basketball. This is an infrastructure-building moment for the league, and infrastructure is built on durable fandom, requires something specific. A product on the floor that gives casual interest into durable fandom requires something specific. A product on the floor that gives casual viewers an emotional reason to invest. Competitive star players in situations where they can succeed visibly matter. What does not convert casual viewers into committed fans is watching the league's biggest star look uncomfortable in a system that doesn't appear designed around her strengths, losing to a team with a 10-win record from the previous season, in a game where the head coach is audibly uncertain about the opponent's final possession. The historical pattern worth examining here runs through multiple WNBA franchise-building eras. Stars entering the league with enormous market expectations, placed inside organizational structures that lag behind the talent they've been handed, spending their developmental years inside systems that constrain rather than amplify what makes them special. The pattern is not unique to women's basketball. It repeats at every level of professional sports when front office decision-making doesn't match the urgency of the moment. The difference in Clark's case is the scale of the watching audience and how compressed the timeline is for the league to get this right before that audience's patience runs out. Caitlin Clark's injury situation is an undercurrent that the fan base cannot fully separate from everything else happening. The broadcast's conflicting signals during the game, initially a back injury, then possibly a hip flexor, then speculation about a groin issue, left viewers at home cycling through exactly the kind of uncertainty that defined the most frustrating stretches of last season. Fans who watched Clark absorb physical punishment throughout the previous year, with questions constantly swirling about protection, officiating consistency, and institutional support around her health, are not in a position to receive ambiguous injury signals with equanimity. That history lives in the fan base's memory, and it shapes how every piece of new information about her physical condition gets processed. What the next 10 games need to demonstrate is specific and measurable. The screen setting issue can be corrected without any roster moves. It is an execution problem that coaching addresses in practice and reinforces in film sessions. If Clark is still getting hacked on every possession without structural relief after 3 more games, that is a coaching choice, not an adjustment delay. Raven Johnson's minutes are within the coaching staff's complete control right now, and the decision to restrict a dynamic young guard while the offense is misfiring is a statement about coaching flexibility that speaks for itself. The interior length problem is harder to solve in season, but the trade deadline exists for exactly this kind of situation. When a roster's deficiencies are visible and specific and the front office has the willingness to be honest about what they're seeing. Here is what this stretch of the schedule is going to reveal. If Stephanie White demonstrates that the opening night performance was an adjustment problem, if the defensive rotations tighten, if Clark's on-ball usage increases in structured offensive sets, if the bench shows even incremental competitive improvement, then this could be the kind of rough start that gets forgotten by the time June arrives and the standings start mattering. If the problems persist across the next week and a half of games, and particularly if the injury uncertainty around Clark begins translating into missed appearances, then the conversations happening in comment sections and fan communities right now will migrate into the broader sports media conversation at a volume that places genuine pressure on the front office to make visible decisions. The burden of proof has shifted entirely. It now sits on the people inside that organization. The fan base showed up, filled the building, watched everything they had worried about materialize in real time, and they are waiting to see whether the institutional response matches the urgency of the moment. The coaches and front office have the ability to change this story completely, but the calendar is not sympathetic, and the audience watching this franchise right now is paying closer attention than it ever has before. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the next chapter of this develops, you want to be ahead of it. And based on the trajectory of everything we just broke down, this story is not slowing down anytime soon.